There is a truth the modern mind avoids, yet the unconscious never forgets. Suffering is not an accident of Lafitte, his life insisting on transformation. What you resist in pain will return as fate. What you endure consciously becomes your evolution. Carl Jung would not ask you to escape suffering. He would ask you to enter it with awareness, because within the wound lies the map of your becoming. Below are 5 keynotes of inner transformation. Suffering does not arrive as an enemy at your door, it arrives as a messenger you have been avoiding your entire life. It speaks in a language most people refuse to learn, because it does not whisper comfort, it demands honesty. And honesty, when it comes from the depths of the psyche, is rarely gentle. There is a version of you that has remained unlived, not because it is weak, but because it is too powerful, too real, too dangerous for the life you have chosen to maintain. This unlived self is not a fantasy, it is not imagination. It is a living force within you, buried beneath years of conditioning, fear, expectations, and silent compromises. It is the artist you silenced, the truth you swallowed, the courage you postponed, the identity you betrayed in order to belong. And when you betray that deeper self long enough, suffering begins. Not as punishment but as correction. You feel it in moments when everything seems fine on the surface, yet something inside you feels empty, restless, agitated. You feel it in the quiet dissatisfaction that success cannot erase. You feel it in the anxiety that appears without clear reason. You feel it in the heaviness that follows you even when you are surrounded by people. This is not randomness. This is the voice of the life you did not live. It begins subtly. A discomfort here, a sense of unease there, a quiet question that rises in your mind. Is this really who I am? Most people silence that question immediately. They distract themselves, they scroll, they chase approval, they drown the signal with noise. But the unconscious is patient. It does not shout at first, it waits. And when you continue to ignore it, the whisper becomes a weight. What was once a subtle discomfort becomes anxiety. What was once a question becomes confusion. What was once a feeling becomes suffering. And still many refuse to listen, because to truly listen would require something terrifying. Sanjay. To listen to suffering means to admit that the life you are living may not be your own. It means acknowledging that you have built an identity based not on truth but on adaptation. You became what was acceptable. You chose what was safe. You followed what was expected. And in doing so, you slowly abandoned what was real. But the unlived self does not die. It waits. It grows stronger in silence, gathering energy in the unconscious until it can no longer be contained. And when it emerges, it does not ask politely, it disrupts your life. It breaks your routines. It shatters your illusions. It forces you into confrontation with everything you have avoided. This is why suffering often feels disproportionate to the situation. It is not just about what is happening now, it is about everything that has been suppressed for years. It is accumulated truth demanding recognition. Think of the moments when you felt lost without explanation, when you achieved something you thought you wanted, yet felt nothing, when relationships failed in patterns you could not understand, when motivation disappeared and you could not force yourself forward no matter how hard you tried. These are signs of weakness. These are signals. They are evidence that your conscious life has drifted too far from your authentic nature. The psyche is trying to realign you, but it cannot do so without resistance, and that resistance is experienced as pain. You see, the unlived self is not comfortable. It does not fit neatly into the life you have constructed. It challenges your habits. It questions your beliefs. It demands that you confront fears you have spent years avoiding. And this is why most people remain in suffering. Not because they cannot change, but because they are unwilling to face what their suffering is asking of them. They want relief without reflection, peace without truth, transformation without sacrifice. But the psyche does not negotiate on these terms. If you truly listen to your suffering, you will begin to notice patterns. You will see that your pain is not random, it is precise. It points to specific areas of your life where you are not being honest with yourself. It may point to a career that does not reflect your true interests, a relationship where you are not fully seen, a lifestyle that feels empty despite external success, a fear that has dictated you in your decisions for years. And the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. Your suffering is not trying to destroy you, it is trying to reveal you. But revelation comes at a cost, because once you see the truth, you cannot unsee it. Once you recognize that your pain is connected to an unlived life, you are faced with a choice. Continue as you are, knowing the cost, or begin the difficult process of change. and change, real change, is not comfortable. It requires you to dismantle parts of your identity, to let go of roles that once protected you, to face uncertainty without guarantees, to risk failure, rejection, and loneliness. This is why many people retreat. They hear the voice of their suffering, but they do not follow it. They choose familiarity over authenticity, and in doing so, their suffering does not disappear, it deepens, because now it is no longer just the pain of the unlived self, it is the pain of knowing. But for those who choose to listen, something extraordinary begins to happen. The same suffering that once felt like a burden becomes a guide. You begin to see it differently. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" you ask, "What is this trying to show me?" And in that shift, suffering transforms. It becomes meaningful. You start to uncover parts of yourself you had forgotten, desires that were buried, strengths that were never developed, truths that were never spoken. You begin to make different choices, small at first, subtle changes, but each one is aligned with something deeper, something more authentic, and as you move in that direction, something shifts within you. The suffering does not vanish overnight, but it changes in quality. It becomes purposeful. It feels like movement instead of stagnation, growth instead of decay, because you are no longer resisting the message, you are responding to it. This is the paradox. Suffering intensifies when ignored, but transforms when understood. The unlived self does not demand perfection. It does not expect you to become something extraordinary overnight. It only asks that you begin to live in alignment with what is true. And truth, in this sense, is not external. It is internal. It is the quiet knowing you have always felt but rarely trusted. It is the sense of direction that does not come from logic, but from something deeper. It is the feeling that says, "This is right," even when it is difficult. To follow that truth is to reclaim your life. But it is not a one-time decision, it is a continuous process, because the psyche is not static, it evolves. And as it evolves, new aspects of the self emerge, asking to be lived. And each time you ignore them, suffering returns, not as failure but as guidance. So do not fear your suffering. Do not rush to silence it. Do not numb it or escape it. Listen to it. Sit with it long enough to hear what it is saying beneath the noise of your thoughts. Ask it questions. Trace it back to its source. Be honest about what you find, because hidden within your pain is a map that leads not to comfort, but to authenticity. And authenticity, though difficult, is the only path that resolves the conflict within you. Everything else is temporary. Everything else is illusion. The unlived self will not disappear. It will not be negotiated with. It will wait patiently, persistently, until you are ready to listen. And when you do, you will realize something profound. Your suffering was never your enemy. It was your unlived life calling you back to yourself. Worlds. The shadow grows stronger in den. All the part of you that you refuse to see does not disappear. It waits, gathers strength, and learns how to control you from the shadows of your own mind. What you deny within yourself does not dissolve. It transforms into something more powerful, more unpredictable, and far more dangerous than if you had simply faced it in the beginning. There is a hidden dimension of your psyche that does not align with the image you present to the world. It contains everything you were taught to reject. Your anger, your envy, your selfishness, your forbidden desires, your fear, your capacity for destruction, but also your hidden strength, your raw creativity, your untamed truth. This is not a flaw in your nature. This is your shadow. And the tragedy of most human lives is not that they possess a shadow, but that they spend their entire existence pretending it does not exist. From a young age, you were conditioned to become acceptable. You learned which parts of yourself earned approval and which parts brought rejection, so you adapted. You sculpted a version of yourself that could survive in the social world. You became polite where you were naturally intense. You became agreeable where you felt resistance. You became calm where you felt rage. You became selfless where you felt desire. And slowly, without realizing it, you began to exile parts of your own being. But the psyche does not operate on the rules of society. It does not discard what is inconvenient. It stores it. Everything you reject is pushed into the unconscious. Where it does not die, it accumulates energy. At first, this seems harmless. You appear functional, even admirable. You are in control. You are disciplined. You are good. But beneath that surface, something is growing, because every suppressed emotion, every denied impulse, every unacknowledged truth is still alive within you, and the longer it is denied, the more pressure it builds. This is why denial is so dangerous, because what is denied does not remain passive, it becomes autonomous. it begins to express itself in indirect ways. You may notice sudden bursts of anger that seem out of proportion. You may feel jealousy you cannot explain. You may sabotage your own progress without understanding why. You may project your own darkness onto others, seeing in them what you refuse to see in yourself. This is the shadow at work. It does not announce itself clearly. It does not say this is your suppressed fear speaking. Instead, it disguises itself. It hides behind rationalizations, justifications, and illusions. You say, they are the problem, when in reality, you are encountering a reflection of something unresolved within you. You say, I am just stressed, when in reality, you are carrying years of unprocessed emotion. You say, this is not like me, without realizing that it is exactly like you. It is just the part you never allowed yourself to know. And so the shadow grows, not because it is inherently evil but because it is ignored. What is acknowledged can be understood. What is understood can be integrated. But what is denied becomes distorted. Imagine a force within you that contains immense energy that could be used for creativity, assertiveness, passion, transformation. But because you refuse to face it, it has no conscious outlet. It becomes trapped, compressed, intensified. Eventually it finds a way out. And when it does, it is no longer under your control. This is when people act in ways that shock even themselves. They say things they never thought they would say. They make decisions that contradict their values. They destroy relationships, opportunities, even their own sense of identity. And afterward they are left asking, why did I do that? The answer is simple but difficult to accept, because it was always part of you. Not the version of you that you show to the world, but the version you refuse to confront. Denial creates a false sense of control. It allows you to believe that you are only what you choose to see. But the psyche is whole, not selective. You are not only your strengths, you are also your weaknesses. You are not only your light, you are also your darkness. And true control does not come from denial, it comes from awareness. Because when you become aware of your shadow, something changes. It no longer needs to act behind your back. It no longer needs to erupt in destructive ways. It becomes something you can work with, but this requires courage. Because to face your shadow is to confront aspects of yourself that you may not like. It is to admit that you are capable of things you once judged in others. It is to see your own hypocrisy, your own contradictions, your own hidden motives. It is not comfortable, but it is necessary. Because the alternative is to remain controlled by forces you do not understand. The shadow does not make you bad, it makes you human. And when you begin to accept this, something powerful happens. You stop projecting your darkness onto others. You stop being triggered by things you do not understand. You stop fearing your own impulses. Instead, you begin to integrate them. Integration does not mean acting on every impulse. It does not mean becoming destructive or reckless. It means acknowledging what exists within you and finding a conscious way to channel it. Your anger can become assertiveness. Your desire can become creativity. Your fear can become awareness. Your intensity can become strength. But none of this is possible as long as you remain in denial, because denial keeps these forces in the dark, where they cannot be transformed, and the longer they remain there, the more distorted they become. This is why some of the most controlled individuals eventually collapse. They have spent years suppressing their shadow, building an identity based on perfection, discipline, and control. But beneath that structure is a growing pressure that cannot be sustained forever, and when it breaks completely. Because what was denied for years demands expression all at once. This is not transformation, this is eruption. True transformation is gradual, it is conscious. It is the process of bringing the shadow into the light, piece by piece, and learning to coexist with it. It is not about eliminating darkness, it is about understanding it. Because within your shadow is not only your potential for destruction, but also your potential for greatness. The same force that can lead to anger can lead to leadership. The same depth that can create despair can create profound insight. The same intensity that can cause chaos can create extraordinary achievement. But only if it is integrated, only if it is faced, only if it is no longer denied. So the question is not whether you have a shadow, you do. The question is whether you are willing to see it. Because the moment you do, you take the first step toward real power. Not the illusion of control, but the reality of self-awareness. And in that awareness, the shadow loses its ability to control you from the dark. It becomes part of you, not your enemy, not your master, but your ally. But if, you continue to deny it, it will continue to grow, quietly, patiently, until one day it no longer asks for your attention, it demands it. Pain is the alchemy of consciousness. Pain has always been misunderstood because it refuses to explain itself in comforting language. It does not arrive with clarity, nor does it immediately reveal its purpose. It burns, it disrupts, it unsettles, and in doing so, it forces the mind into a confrontation it would otherwise spend a lifetime avoiding. Yet beneath this disturbance lies something ancient and transformative, something that has shaped every awakened human being across time. Pain is not merely an experience, it is a process. It is the alchemy through which unconscious life is turned into conscious awareness. Most people encounter pain as something to escape. The instinct is immediate and almost automatic. Suppress it, distract from it, numb it, deny it, outrun it. Entire lives are constructed around this avoidance. People chase pleasure, validation, comfort, and security not only because they desire them, but because they are attempting to stay one step ahead of the discomfort that threatens to surface. But pain, unlike external problems, cannot be permanently avoided. It does not exist outside of you, it emerges from within, and wherever you go, it follows. What makes pain so powerful is not its intensity, but its persistence. It returns, it repeats, it evolves, and every time it comes back it carries a deeper message, a more urgent demand for attention. The psyche does not create pain without purpose. It uses it as a tool, a pressure mechanism designed to break through the rigid structures of the ego and reveal something that has been hidden, ignored, or suppressed. To understand pain as alchemy is to understand that it is not static. It is not meant to remain as suffering forever. It is meant to transform, but transformation requires participation. Pain alone does not change you, your relationship to pain does. When pain is unconscious, it traps you in cycles. You react without understanding. You repeat patterns without awareness. You feel overwhelmed without knowing why. In this state, pain feels meaningless, almost cruel. It seems like something happening to you, something imposed from the outside, something you are a victim of. But when pain becomes conscious, something shifts. Instead of reacting, you begin to observe. Instead of resisting, you begin to question. Instead of escaping, you begin to explore. And in that subtle shift from avoidance to awareness, the alchemical process begins. You start to notice that pain has layers. What you feel on the surface is rarely the full story. Beneath anger there may be hurt. Beneath hurt there may be fear. Beneath fear there may be a deep, unacknowledged truth about your life, something you have known for a long time but never fully faced. Pain strips away illusion. It removes the narratives you use to protect yourself. It exposes contradictions. It reveals the gap between who you are and who you pretend to be. And this is why it feels so destabilizing, because it threatens the identity you have built. The ego resists this process with everything it has. It clings to certainty, to control, to familiar patterns. It interprets pain as a threat because pain signals change, and change threatens the ego's sense of stability. But the deeper self, the part of you that seeks growth, truth, and wholeness, recognizes pain differently. It sees it as necessary. This is the paradox. What the ego fears, the deeper self requires. Pain becomes alchemical when you stop asking it to disappear and start asking it to reveal. When you sit with it not for a moment, not until it becomes unbearable, but long enough to understand its structure, you begin to see that it is not chaos. It has form, it has direction, it has meaning, and as you follow that meaning, you begin to uncover parts of yourself that were previously inaccessible. You discover your limits not as barriers, but as edges that can be expanded. You encounter your fears not as enemies, but as indicators of where growth is possible. You recognize your wounds not as weaknesses, but as entry points into deeper understanding. This is the work of transformation. It is not dramatic. It is not immediate. It is slow, often uncomfortable, sometimes exhausting, but it is real, because every time you consciously engage with pain, you change your relationship to it. You reduce its power to control you unconsciously. You bring light into areas of your psyche that were previously in darkness, and in doing so you reclaim energy. Energy that was once trapped in suppression, denial, and avoidance becomes available for something else: creativity, clarity, strength, purpose. This is why individuals who have deeply engaged with their pain often carry a certain presence. It is not that they have suffered more than others, it is that they have processed their suffering differently. They have allowed it to shape them, not by breaking them, but by refining them. Pain, in this sense, is a furnace. What enters it is not the same as what emerges, but the outcome depends on whether you remain in the fire unconsciously or step into it with awareness. If you remain unconscious, pain consumes you. It leads to bitterness, resentment, stagnation. It reinforces patterns. It deepens confusion. But if you become conscious within the experience, pain transforms you. It clarifies. It sharpens. It deepens your understanding of yourself and the world around you. You begin to see connections you could not see before. You understand your reactions, your patterns, your choices. You recognize how your past has shaped your present, and with that recognition comes something powerful, the ability to choose differently. This is where true transformation occurs, not in the absence of pain, but in the integration of it, because once pain has been made conscious, it no longer needs to repeat itself in the same way. The lesson has been learned, the message has been received, but this does not mean pain disappears from your life. It means your relationship to it changes. You no longer fear it in the same way. You no longer see it as purely negative. You begin to recognize it as part of a larger process, a process that is guiding you toward a more complete version of yourself. And with that recognition comes a certain resilience, not the kind that resists pain, but the kind that can endure it without losing direction, the kind that understands that discomfort is not always a sign of failure, it is often a sign of movement. You start to trust the process, even when you do not fully understand it. You develop patience, because you see that transformation cannot be rushed. You develop humility, because you recognize how much of yourself remains unknown. And perhaps most importantly, you develop depth, because pain, when processed consciously, expands your capacity to feel, to understand, to connect. It breaks down superficial layers and forces you into something more real. This depth changes how you relate to others. You become less judgmental because you understand that everyone carries unseen struggles. You become more empathetic because you have faced your own darkness. You become more authentic because you no longer need to hide behind illusions. And in that authenticity, something else emerges: strength. Not the rigid, defensive strength of someone trying to appear unbreakable, but a flexible, grounded strength that comes from knowing you can face what arises. This is the result of alchemy. The raw material of pain is transformed into something of value: wisdom, awareness, resilience, authenticity. But like all alchemical processes, it cannot be forced. It requires time. It requires honesty. It requires a willingness to stay present with discomfort long enough for it to reveal its nature. Most people interrupt this process. They exit too early. They seek relief before understanding. And in doing so, they miss the transformation that pain was offering. Because pain is not just something to be endured, it is something to be understood. And understanding is what changes everything. When you understand your pain, you are no longer at its mercy. You are in relationship with it. You can learn from it, work with it, grow. Through it, it becomes part of your evolution. And over time, you begin to see a pattern. Every significant transformation in your life was preceded by discomfort. Every moment of growth was initiated by some form of pain. Every expansion of awareness came from a place of tension or struggle. Nothing meaningful emerged from comfort alone, and this realization shifts your entire perspective. You no longer seek a life free of pain, because you understand that such a life would also be free of growth. Instead, you seek a life in which pain has purpose, a life in which every difficulty is an opportunity for deeper awareness. This does not make pain pleasant, it makes it meaningful, and meaning changes everything. Because when pain has meaning, it is no longer something you simply endure, it becomes something you engage with. It becomes part of your path, part of your transformation, part of the ongoing process of becoming more conscious, more whole, more aligned with the truth of who you are. And in that process, you begin to realize something profound. The very thing you once feared as an obstacle was, in fact, the doorway. Pain was never the end of your story. It was the fire that made you capable of becoming who you were meant to be. The ego must break for the self to emerge. There comes a moment in every human life when the structure you have built to define yourself begins to crack, not gradually at first, but in ways that feel abrupt, disorienting, even unjust. What once gave you certainty begins to fail you. What once felt like identity begins to feel like a mask, and what once gave you control begins to slip through your fingers. This moment is often interpreted as collapse, as loss, as the beginning of something going wrong. But at a deeper level, it is something far more precise. It is the beginning of the ego's dissolution so that something more authentic can emerge. The ego, as you have come to know it, is not your true self. It is a construction. A necessary one, yes, but still a construction. It is built from your experiences, your environment, your upbringing, your successes, your failures, your roles, your labels, your beliefs about who you are and who you should be. It is the identity you learn to wear in order to navigate the world, and for a time it works. It gives you direction. It creates a sense of stability. It allows you to function, to relate, to pursue goals, to survive. But the problem is not that the ego exists. The problem is that you begin to believe that it is all that you are. You cling to it. You defend it. You organize your entire life around maintaining it. You say, "This is who I am," without realizing that what you are describing is only a fragment of a much larger, deeper reality. And the more rigid this identity becomes, the more fragile it becomes as well. Because life does not conform to the ego's expectations. Life is unpredictable. It changes, it disrupts, it challenges, and when it does, the ego experiences this not as adjustment, but as threat. It resists. It tries to maintain control. It doubles down on what it knows, even when what it knows is no longer working. This is where suffering intensifies, because the ego cannot evolve on its own. It can adapt, yes, but only within its existing framework. It cannot transcend itself, and so when deeper transformation is required, something else must occur. The ego must break, not as an act of destruction, but as an act of necessity. This breaking is rarely gentle. It often comes through failure, loss, confusion, crisis. Moments where the identity you have relied on can no longer hold. You may lose a role that defined you, a relationship that anchored you, a belief that guided you, a sense of certainty that once made everything feel clear. And in that loss you feel disoriented. You ask, "Who am I without this?" And for the first time the question is real, because before the answer was given to you by your ego. Now, the answer is unknown. This is the threshold. Most people, when they reach this point, do everything they can to rebuild the ego as quickly as possible. They search for new labels, new roles, new identities to replace what was lost. They want to feel stable again. They want to regain control. And this is understandable. But it is also what prevents true transformation. Because if you rush to reconstruct the ego, you miss the opportunity to discover what lies beyond it. The breaking of the ego is not the end, it is an opening into the self. The self in this sense is not something you create. It is something you uncover. It is the deeper totality of your being that exists beyond the limited identity of the ego. It includes everything, the conscious and the unconscious, and the shadow, the known and the unknown. But the self cannot fully emerge as long as the ego remains rigid and dominant. Because the ego filters reality. It selects what aligns with its identity and rejects what does not. It narrows your perception. It keeps you within familiar boundaries. The self, on the other hand, expands. It does not reject, it integrates. It does not cling, it allows. It does not define itself narrowly, it embraces complexity. To move from ego to self is not to eliminate the ego, but to reposition it. The ego becomes a part of you, not the whole of you. It becomes a tool, not your identity. But this shift requires that the ego first loosens its grip, and it rarely does so willingly. This is why the breaking feels so intense, because it is not just external circumstances that are changing, it is your entire internal structure of meaning, the way you see yourself, the way you interpret your life, the way you understand your place in the world. All of it is being questioned. This can feel like chaos, like groundlessness, like losing yourself. But in truth, you are not losing yourself, you are losing what you are not. And that distinction is crucial, because if you misunderstand this process, you will resist it. You will fight to preserve an identity that is no longer aligned with your deeper nature. You will interpret the breaking as failure rather than transformation. But if you understand it, even partially, you can begin to cooperate with it. You can allow the uncertainty. You can sit with the not knowing. You can resist the urge to immediately define yourself again. And in that space, uncomfortable, unfamiliar, often frightening, something new begins to take shape. Not as a fixed identity, but as a deeper awareness. You start to notice aspects of yourself that were previously hidden. You become aware of patterns that once operated unconsciously. You see contradictions within yourself that you had ignored. And instead of trying to resolve them immediately, you begin to hold them. This is the beginning of integration. You no longer need to be one thing. You no longer need to fit into a single consistent identity. You can be complex, evolving, multifaceted. And in that complexity there is a different kind of stability. not the rigid stability of the ego, but a flexible stability that can adapt, grow and change without collapsing. This is the strength of the self. It does not depend on external validation. It does not require constant reinforcement. It is rooted in awareness, not in image. And as it emerges, your relationship to life changes. You are less reactive because you are not defending a fixed identity. You are more open because you are not confined by rigid beliefs. You are more authentic because you are not trying to maintain a facade. This does not mean life becomes easy. It means you become more capable of engaging with it, because you are no longer operating from a place of fear-based control, but from a place of conscious participation. The breaking of the ego, then, is not something to avoid, it is something to understand. It is part of a larger process of psychological development, a necessary phase in the journey toward wholeness, but it requires patience, because the self does not emerge overnight. It unfolds gradually, through experience, through reflection, through the continuous process of becoming aware of what was previously unconscious. And each time the ego tries to reassert itself in rigid ways, life will present new challenges, gestures, new disruptions, new opportunities for further transformation. This is not punishment, it is refinement. You are being shaped not into something artificial, but into something more aligned with your true nature. And this shaping requires that what is false, limited, or outdated be released, even when it feels like loss, even when it feels like breaking, because only in that breaking can something deeper come through, something that was always there but could not be seen through the narrow lens of the ego. And when you begin to experience life from that deeper place, you realize that the identity you once fought so hard to protect was never meant to contain you. It was a starting point, not a destination. The real journey begins when it cracks, when you stop asking, "How do I hold myself together?" and start asking, "What is trying to emerge through this?" Because that question shifts everything. It turns breakdown into breakthrough. It transforms confusion into exploration. It allows you to move not backward into what was, but forward into what is becoming. And in that movement, you begin to recognize that the breaking was never the end of you. It was the and so the illusion you thought you had to be. And beyond that illusion, something far more real is waiting, not fixed, not defined, but alive, and finally free to emerge. Transformation requires participation, not escape. EXPNDITMOR ELOUTNTH ILTHANDH ANDTONENTYF IVEWORLDs. There is a quiet illusion that governs much of human behavior, the belief that transformation will come without direct involvement, that change can be achieved by thinking about it, wishing for it, or waiting long enough for circumstances to shift on their own. It is a comforting idea because it allows you to remain where you are while imagining a different future. But transformation does not respond to imagination alone. It responds to participation. To participate means to step into the process, not as an observer, but as an active force within it. It means you do not stand outside your life, hoping it will rearrange itself into something meaningful. Enter it fully, with awareness, with intention, and with the willingness to be changed by what you encounter. Most people do not realize how deeply they are invested in escape. Escape does not always look dramatic. It is not only found in obvious ratios or avoidance behaviors. It exists in subtle forms, in overthinking without action, in planning without execution, in seeking endless advice without applying any of it, in waiting for the right time that never arrives. It is present whenever you distance yourself from the reality of your own life, instead of engaging with it directly. Escape is seductive because it reduces discomfort in the moment. It gives the illusion of control. It allows you to avoid risk, avoid failure, avoid confrontation with your own limitations. But what it also does, quietly and consistently, is prevent growth. Because growth requires friction. It requires encountering resistance, internal and external, and moving through it consciously. It requires facing what is difficult, not turning away from it. It requires making decisions that disrupt your current patterns rather than reinforce them. Transformation is not something that happens to you, it is something that happens through you. And this distinction is essential. If you see yourself as passive, waiting for life to change, you remain dependent on external conditions. You become reactive. Your sense of progress is tied to circumstances you cannot fully control. But when you recognize that transformation requires your participation, your position shifts. You become responsible not in a burdensome sense, but in an empowering one. You realize that while you may not control everything that happens to you, you do have influence over how you engage with it. Participation begins with awareness. You must first see where you are avoiding your own life. Where are you delaying action? Where are you choosing comfort over truth? Where are you repeating patterns that you already know lead to dissatisfaction? These are not abstract questions, they are precise indicators of where participation is required. But awareness alone is not enough, because it is entirely possible to become aware of your patterns and still remain within them. You can understand your fears, analyze your habits, even articulate your limitations with clarity, and yet nothing changes. Why? Because understanding without action is another form of escape. It gives you the feeling of progress without the reality of it. True participation demands that you move beyond understanding into engagement. It asks you to take what you know and apply it, even when it feels uncomfortable, even when the outcome is uncertain. This is where resistance appears. The moment you attempt to step out of your familiar patterns, you encounter internal pushback. Doubt arises, fear intensifies. The mind begins to generate reasons why now is not the right time, why the risk is too great, why the effort may not be worth it. This resistance is not a sign that you are on the wrong path. It is a sign that you are approaching something meaningful, because the psyche resists change that threatens its current structure, even if that structure is limiting. It prefers the known, even when the known is unsatisfying, over the unknown, which carries uncertainty. To participate in transformation is to move through this resistance, not by eliminating it, but by not allowing it to dictate your actions. You act despite the doubt. You move despite the fear. You engage despite the discomfort. And in doing so, something shifts. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually. Each act of participation weakens the hold of your old patterns. Each decision aligned with growth reinforces a new direction. Each step taken in uncertainty builds a different kind of confidence. You can see not the confidence of guaranteed success, but the confidence of knowing you can face what arises. This is how transformation unfolds. Not in a single moment of realization, but in a series of conscious choices repeated over time. And these choices are often small. They are found in how you respond to a difficult conversation, in whether you avoid or address a problem, in whether you follow through on something you said you would do, in whether you remain honest with yourself when it would be easier not to. These moments may seem insignificant individually, but collectively they shape your trajectory. Because transformation is not about grand gestures, it is about consistent participation. It is about showing up again and again, even when motivation fluctuates, even when results are not immediately visible. Escape, on the other hand, is inconsistent. It moves in cycles, periods of intention followed by withdrawal, moments of clarity followed by avoidance. It never sustains momentum because it is not grounded in action, and over time this creates a sense of stagnation. You feel as though you are not moving forward, even though you have spent significant time thinking about change. This is one of the most frustrating experiences, being aware of the need for transformation, yet not experiencing it. But the reason is not mysterious. It is the absence of participation. Once you recognize this, the path becomes clearer, though not easier, because participation requires you to relinquish certain comforts. It asks you to give up the idea that you can remain the same while expecting different results. It challenges the belief that you can avoid discomfort and still grow. It confronts the tendency to wait for perfect conditions. There are no perfect conditions. There is only the present moment with its imperfections, its limitations, its opportunities. And participation means working within that reality, not outside of it. It means starting where you are, not where you wish you were. It means using what you have, not waiting for what you lack. It means engaging with your life as it is, not as you imagine it should be. This grounded approach is what allows transformation to become real, because it anchors change in action, not in abstraction. And as you continue to participate, something deeper begins to develop. You become more attuned to yourself. You notice your tendencies more quickly. You recognize when you are slipping into avoidance. You catch patterns earlier before they fully take hold. This increased awareness makes participation more natural. It becomes less about forcing yourself to act and more about aligning with what you already know to be true. And over time, the gap between awareness and action narrows. You think less and do more. You hesitate less and engage more. You escape less and participate more. This does not mean you eliminate struggle. It means you relate to it differently. Struggle becomes part of the process, not something to be avoided at all costs. Difficulty becomes information, not obstruction. Failure becomes feedback, not finality. And this shift changes your entire experience of transformation. It becomes dynamic. It becomes something you are actively involved in, rather than something you are passively waiting for. You begin to see that every situation, no matter how challenging, contains an opportunity for participation, a chance to respond differently, a chance to act with greater awareness, a chance to move closer to alignment with your deeper self. And as why I take these chances repeatedly, consistently, transformation becomes inevitable, not because it was forced, but because it was lived, because you chose to engage rather than escape, because you remained present rather than withdrawing, because you participated in your own becoming. And in that participation, you discover something that escape can never offer, a sense of ownership over your life. Not in the sense that you control everything, but in the sense that you are no longer disconnected from your own experience. You are involved, you are engaged, you are part of the process. And that makes all the difference, because transformation is not a destination you arrive at, it is a continuous unfolding that depends on your willingness to take part in it, not once, not occasionally, but consistently. And when you commit to that participation, even imperfectly, even with hesitation, even with doubt, you begin to move. And movement, no matter how small, is the beginning of change. The moment you stop escaping and start participating is the moment your life begins to transform, not because everything becomes easier, but because you are finally present within it. And in presence is where all real transformation begins. Final reflection. Expend it more lengthy without heading at the end of all struggle, after the noise of resistance has quieted and the illusions you once clung to have begun to dissolve. You are left with something far more honest than comfort awareness, not the kind that comes from reading or listening, but the kind that is carved into you through experience, the kind that changes how you see everything, including yourself. You begin to understand that nothing you went through was meaningless. Even the moments that felt like chaos, like breakdown, like unbearable weight, each of them carried a hidden structure, a direction you could not see at the time. What once felt like random suffering now reveals itself as a sequence, almost as if something deeper within you was guiding the process all along. And this realization does not come as a sudden revelation. It emerges slowly, quietly, through reflection. You look back and begin to connect the pieces, the pain that forced you to question, the confusion that pushed you inward, the loss that stripped away what was never truly yours, the discomfort that refused to let you remain where they were. You start to see that every time you tried to escape, life brought you back, not to punish you, but to insist that you engage, that you look deeper, that you stop living on the surface of yourself. And perhaps the most profound shift is this: you no longer see suffering as something that interrupted your life, you see it as something that revealed it. Because without it, you would have continued in patterns that felt safe but were ultimately empty. You would have stayed within identities that were accepted but not authentic. You would have avoided questions that, once asked, changed everything. Suffering forced you into honesty, and honesty, though uncomfortable, is the foundation of transformation. There is a certain humility that comes with this understanding. You realize how little control you truly had over the deeper movements of your life, how often you mistook temporary stability for permanence, how frequently you resisted what was necessary simply because it was difficult. But along with that humility comes a different kind of strength, not the strength of control, but the strength of trust. Trust in the process even when it is unclear. Trust in your capability to endure and adapt. Trust that what feels like breaking may actually be opening. You begin to live differently, not in a dramatic, externally visible way, but in a quieter, more grounded manner. You become less concerned with maintaining an image and more concerned with maintaining alignment. You listen more carefully to your thoughts, your emotions, your reactions, because you understand that they are not random. They are signals. You stop asking, "How do I avoid discomfort?" and start asking, "What is this experience asking of me?" And in that shift, life becomes less about control and more about participation. You are no longer trying to force everything into a predefined structure. You are engaging with what arises, responding consciously rather than reacting automatically. This does not mean you have everything figured out. In fact, you become more comfortable with not knowing, because you realize that certainty was often an illusion, a way of protecting yourself from the anxiety of the unknown. And once that illusion fades, you are left with something more real: an openness to experience, a willingness to explore, a readiness to adapt. You begin to see yourself not as a fixed identity but as something evolving, something in motion, something that is shaped continuously by experience, awareness, and choice. And this perspective changes how you relate to your past. You no longer see it as a series of mistakes or regrets. You see it as material-raw, sometimes painful but necessary for what you have become. Even the parts you once wished to erase now hold value, because they contributed to your understanding. Nothing is wasted. Everything becomes part of the whole. And this sense of wholeness is perhaps the most important realization of all. Because for so long you may have lived in fragments, presenting one version of yourself to the world while hiding another, striving to be one thing while suppressing another. This internal division creates tension, and that tension manifests as suffering. But as you begin to integrate what was once separated, something shifts. You feel more coherent, more grounded, more real. Not perfect, not without conflict, but more aligned. And in that alignment there is a kind of peace, not the absence of difficulty, but the absence of inner contradiction. You are no longer fighting yourself in the SM way. You are working with yourself, and that changes everything. Because when you are no longer divided, your energy is no longer wasted in internal conflict. It becomes available for growth, for creation, for meaningful engagement with the world. You move with more clarity, not because you have all the answers, but because you are no longer avoiding the questions. You act with more intention, not because you are certain of the outcome, but because you are aligned with your direction. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to accept that transformation is not a one-time event, it is ongoing. There is no final version of yourself that you arrive at and remain forever. There are only phases, stages, cycles of growth and integration. Each time you expand your awareness, new challenges emerge, new aspects of yourself come into focus, new opportunities for transformation appear, and instead of resisting this, you begin to welcome it, not because it is easy, but because you understand its value. You understand that growth requires movement, and movement requires change, and change inevitably brings discomfort. But now that discomfort no longer feels like an enemy eye, like a signal, a sign that something within you is shifting, evolving, becoming. You no longer run from it, you turn toward it, carefully, consciously, but willingly, because you have learned that on the other side of that discomfort is something essential: greater awareness, deeper understanding, a more authentic expression of who you are. And so, you continue, not perfectly, not without hesitation, but with a growing sense of trust in the process. You accept that there will be moments of doubt, moments of confusion, moments where you feel lost again. But you also know that these moments are not regressions, they are part of the path. Each time you move through them, you carry something forward, something that cannot be taken away. Experience, insight, depth, and over time these accumulate. They shape you into someone who is not defined by circumstances, but by the way you engage with them. Someone who is not easily shaken, not because life is stable, but because your relationship to instability has changed. Someone who does not avoid reality, but meets it fully, honestly. And in that honesty you discover a different kind of freedom. Not the freedom of having no problems, but the freedom of no longer being controlled by them. The freedom of awareness, the freedom of choice, the freedom of being able to respond rather than react. And perhaps that is what all of this has been leading toward. Not perfection, not constant happiness, but a deeper, more grounded way of being. A way of living that is rooted in truth, shaped by experience, and open to continuous transformation. And when you reach this understanding, even briefly, you realize something that changes how you see everything that came before. You were never meant to avoid suffering. You were meant to grow through it, not as someone who escapes life, but as someone who becomes more fully alive within it.